So it'd be like this. Part 3 of the reality of Reymega Life Legacy, the legacy of Raymond. I think it'll go like this. You'll be, if it were to come out, like my nephews would be out there, say, your uncle was a domestic terrorist that upended the lives of millions of people, and including Hollywood, because he didn't get over his crush, who basically became an etheric being today, 16 years ago, and so we had to establish a marriage unit surveillance system in Hollywood, upending the lives of tens of thousands of people, employees, and destroying it. And also, not to mention the fact that his pathway, all his stuff will be scrutinized, all his academic stuff, all his pathway, all his stuff will be scrutinized for terrorism, and all his stuff will be scrutinized. And people like PAX, the whole Mega 64, they would say, well, this you gave platform to a terrorist. You gave platform to a terrorist who basically upended and destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of people, and millions of people, and it'll be like this. I think if it would be like, this is the realest thing, not the parental bullshit where they think everything is peachy. I think that it'll go like this, and the fact that they allowed this guy to have an internship at IKEA for 3 years while he was a domestic terrorist, type of deal. They're gonna probably say, how the fuck did this happen? How the fuck did all this happen? How the fuck was he enabled? How the fuck did they enable this guy to be in an internship in IKEA while he was a domestic terrorist? Or it'll probably go like this. How the fuck did they do this? In PAX, Comic-Con will be basically more federally regulated, under more federal regulations. So that means if you have Comic-Con costumes of Call of Duty stuff, if you have a gun, if you look like a soldier, you're a terrorist. If you have a gun and you're a stormtrooper, they would say, well, that looks like a domestic terrorist, and they could basically shut this stuff down. And not to mention social media will be basically shut down, because and smartphone use will be like only limited to 3 hours a day, because of what it did to his physical health, and what it did to his physical mental health, because he was on it all day long, and it destroyed his physical mental health. I think it will go like this. My legacy will probably be very similar like this. It would be probably, where PAX basically gets shut down. They might shut that down because they would say you gave platform to a terrorist. You gave platform to this guy who basically upended the lives of tens of thousands of people. So you basically could be facing RICO charges, and when you talk about wrestling stuff, they would say, well, all the wrestling championships, if you have replica belts, that could be considered contraband in the future. They would probably say, well, why is it being contraband? Because if you have those things, they could use that's terrorist paraphernalia. That's in the same category as swords and knives and gym equipment, like swords and knives, or katanas. They'll be regulated. They'll have to be. They would say that they're contraband. You know, and if you have a wellness check and if a police officer, probably, or some law enforcement sees a replica championship belt in the future, they could say, well, because of this guy, we can't. This guy, this stuff is contraband, and you're not allowed to have this stuff. You know, that's the legacy in the wrestling world. And, you know, when you talk about, why? Because he used it, and it was because the domestic terrorist used this type of stuff to, yeah, this is what the real thing, the real confession. Because this is the year of the confession. And so I think it'll go like this. And the fact that, it'll be like that, and then all the wrestling fans will be under federal surveillance their whole life. You know, for why? Because they are associated with domestic terrorism. You know, they are associated with domestic terrorism and domestic extremism and stuff. And they would basically look at that as. And they would basically look at this as the reason why the industry falls apart, probably in like 20 years or something. And so all the livelihoods will be destroyed. You know, look, this is what the Reymega Life legacy probably will really be. You know, it's not going to be in the Jesus, Malcolm X, Gandhi, Michael Jackson, John Lennon legacy. It'll probably be more in the O.J. Simpson, Jared Fogle, Chris Benoit, Ted Kaczynski, Charles Manson territory. It'll be more like that territory. It'll be more in that type of deal. Because I think that that's the truth. Or Chris Benoit probably be the same deal. People who upended the lives of countless people, ruined the lives of millions of people, or ruined the lives of traumatized an entire industry, you know, or entire lives or entire culture, and so when you look at the legacy of Reymega Life, this is probably the real deal. This is probably what it'll really be like. And it'll probably really be like this. And the person that upended the lives of his friends, his relatives, basically all destroyed. All destroyed, and the Stellar U farm over there, basically disgraced, associated with grooming a terrorist, as you know what they were doing with the EEG stuff back in '07. They were grooming a domestic terrorist, you know, and they were grooming a domestic terrorist unknowingly, and so they basically are culpable in all the trauma and all the destruction that was caused by this guy who basically lost it when his crush became an etheric being 16 years today, on this very day, and so yeah, that's the legacy part 3.